Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a subject that, well, geographically it's tiny, but its shadow over global energy and trade. Absolutely enormous. We're talking about the Strait of Hormuz. So our mission here is to really unpack the current tensions, which have been seriously escalating around this critical choke point. We'll dig into the global implications, and they are profound, and trace this really complex web of international law, geopolitics, and of course economics that makes it so vital. You've given some great sources covering recent events, the history, potential futures. It's quite a picture, a concerning one, frankly. Okay, let's just start with the scale here, because it's almost unbelievable. Even if you follow energy markets, the sheer volume going through Hormuz is staggering. Our sources flag this. On average, over 21 million barrels of oil pass through the strait every single day.
21 million?
Yeah. That's roughly 21% of all the petroleum the entire world consumes.
Yes.
Just to put that in context, that volume, it actually beats every other maritime choke point. We're talking more than the Suez Canal, more than the Strait of Malacca.
Significantly more.
Right. And it's not only about crude oil.
Yeah.
Huge amounts of liquefied natural gas, LNG, mostly from Qatar. They depend completely on getting through Hormuz, too.
And what's really crucial to grasp about this artery of global commerce is how vulnerable it is physically. I mean, we're not talking vast open seas here.
Right.
The strait itself is narrow, maybe 55 to 95 kilometers wide overall. But here's the kicker. The actual shipping lanes, the deep channels, these huge tankers and LNG carriers have to use, they're incredibly tight, just 2 miles wide in each direction.
2 miles. Wow, that is narrow.
Extremely narrow. And that just dramatically increases the risk for any vessel moving through. It makes it a natural choke point in the truest sense. And what's fascinating and worrying is how the economic security of major importers, think about Asian powerhouses like China, India, Japan, South Korea, it's all directly tied to keeping that single, very constricted pathway open. It's like a massive vulnerability just built into the global system.
So, okay, we've got the scale, the reliance, the inherent physical vulnerability. It's always tense. But what specifically happened recently to ratchet that pressure up again, to bring Hormuz back into the headlines with such, well, urgency? The sources are pretty clear on this. It points directly to a series of U.S. military strikes on Iranian soil. This was back on June 22nd, 2025. And these weren't random. They specifically hit key nuclear sites: Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan.
Right, the known facilities.
Exactly. And then right after that, you had President Trump issuing these direct warnings to Iran, basically telling them to make peace. I mean, this wasn't just simmering tensions boiling over slightly. This felt like a clear, significant escalation. It demanded some kind of response from Tehran.
And that response came quickly and, well, defiantly, as you'd probably expect. Iranian leaders flat out refused to comply with the U.S. warnings. Instead, they almost immediately threatened retaliatory strikes, targeting U.S. bases, regional assets. But the really big move, the one that sent shockwaves, Iran's parliament actually voted to close the Strait of Hormuz. Now, okay, it still needed final approval from their top security council, but the signal it sent globally was just unmistakable. Major escalation. But it's really vital we analyze what that threat actually means. The sources we looked at, they largely see this move, threatening to close the strait, as a kind of desperate bargaining chip.
A last resort, maybe?
Sort of, yeah. A high-risk leverage play against really intense U.S. pressure. Because the cold, hard reality for Iran is that actually doing it, a full closure, it would absolutely cripple their own economy.
How so?
Well, think about it. Roughly 65% of Iran's entire government revenue comes from oil exports. And nearly all of that oil has to go through the strait.
Right.
So imposing a blockade on themselves.
Right. It's economic self-harm on a massive scale.
Precisely. And not only that, it would deeply alienate countries they might see as partners, or at least, sympathetic neutrals, like China, Oman, even Qatar. They all have a huge vested interest in keeping the strait open. So it's this dramatic threat, but it carries immense self-destructive potential for Iran itself.
And that point about self-destruction is reinforced when you look back, right? We need to remember the history here. There have been repeated threats. Tensions have spiked many times. You mentioned 2011, 12, 2018, 19, other periods too. But the Strait of Hormuz has never actually been fully closed.
Never.
Not even during the really intense Iran-Iraq tank war in the 80s when ships were getting hit constantly.
Almost daily, yeah.
The rhetoric gets fiery, absolutely.
Yeah.
But pulling that final trigger, the actual closure, that ultimate economic weapon, it's always stayed just out of reach. Which makes you wonder, is this a threat that's maybe losing some of its punch, a bluff called too many times?
That's the core question, isn't it? The fact it's never happened, even in extreme conflict, it just underscores the massive economic pain it would inflict on Iran itself. And maybe also the international pushback, the sheer difficulty of sustaining a closure against global opposition.
Yeah.
It seems to be a threat that works best just by existing, not by actually being carried out.
Okay, so given that history has never been closed, the next logical question is, what tools does Iran actually have that makes this threat, even if it might be a bluff, so genuinely concerning? What could they actually do if they decided, okay, this time is different, we're going down this path?
Well, Iran has one capability that is particularly significant and, frankly, very concerning, and that's its large stockpile of naval mines.
Mines.
Yes. Sources estimate they have somewhere in the range of 5,000 to 6,000 naval mines, and these aren't just old, simple things. They include advanced types like Russian MDM-6 bottom mines, Chinese EM-52 rocket-propelled mines.
Okay.
And the sources really hammer home why these are so effective, so feared. Mines are, and I'm quoting here, comparatively cheap, easy to deploy, hard to remove, and psychologically intimidating.
That last part seems key. Psychologically intimidating.
Absolutely. Because here's the strategic insight, right? These relatively low-tech weapons can effectively neutralize a much, much more powerful navy. They don't necessarily need to sink a lot of ships. They just need to make passage seem too risky or force traffic to slow to a crawl for painstaking mine-clearing operations. Those bottom mines, especially, they're often undetectable to most ships.
Yeah.
That creates this psychological chokehold. It can achieve a blockade effect without Iran having to directly engage a warship. That's the power of asymmetric warfare. And what's really alarming in this current situation is the intelligence that came out recently. As of July 2025, the U.S. was reporting that Iranian naval forces were seen actively loading mines onto vessels.
Loading them. So preparing for potential deployment.
Exactly. This isn't just rhetoric anymore. It suggests they're actively considering using this option, preparing the logistics for it should they decide things have reached that point. It shows a clear intent to be ready.
Okay, so mines are the big one, almost invisible, creating this huge psychological barrier. Are there other things in their toolkit, other asymmetric capabilities that could make navigating the strait even harder?
Oh, definitely. Mines are probably the cornerstone for a closure strategy, but Iran has other assets too, all designed to make the strait impassable, or at least incredibly dangerous for a time. We're talking about a pretty large fleet of fast attack craft.
Swarm boats.
Yeah, exactly. Small, fast boats that can swarm and overwhelm larger, slower vessels. They also have a significant arsenal of anti-ship missiles, land-based, sea-launched. Add to that drones for surveillance and attack, and even reports of suicide drone boats. So you combine those threats, swarm boats, missiles, drones, with a widely dispersed minefield. You create this really layered, very dangerous environment. It makes any transit attempt an extremely high-risk gamble. The goal isn't necessarily sinking everything. It's about making the cost, in time, money, and potential damage so prohibitively high that shipping just stops.
And this isn't just theoretical. Iran has used mines before, with serious consequences. You mentioned the tanker war.
That's right. Back in the late 1980s, Iran did deploy mines, and there was one very serious incident involving the U.S. Navy. The frigate USS Samuel B hit an Iranian mine in April '88.
Nearly sank it, right?
It did. Came very close and injured quite a few sailors. And that act directly led to a major U.S. response, Operation Praying Mantis. The U.S. Navy hit back hard, sinking or damaging several Iranian warships and hitting oil platforms. So that history really underscores two things. Iran can and has used these disruptive tools before, and second, doing so carries huge risks of escalation and severe retaliation.
It really is sobering when you think how quickly things could spiral, how interconnected everything is. You realize just how dependent we all are on these potential failure points. So let's game this out. If the worst happens, if Iran does follow through on this threat, what's the immediate impact? The real-world fallout that you listening would actually feel. What does it do to our wallets, to the global economy? Well, the immediate economic shock, it would be severe, almost instantaneous. Analysts are pretty much unanimous on this. Brent crude oil prices could shoot past $100 a barrel within minutes of Iran just announcing a closure.
Just the announcement.
Yeah, and some forecasts put it much higher, maybe $110, even $130 US a barrel very quickly. And it's not just oil. LNG spot prices, they'd spike too, maybe hitting $25, $30 per MMBtu. This kind of sudden jump in energy costs would just inject chaos into the system. Asia would get hit hardest initially, being so dependent on Gulf supplies, but the ripple effects, global. Higher transport costs for everything, massive inflationary pressure everywhere.
And beyond the price shock, Think about the logistics for shipping. It would be an absolute nightmare. Just the perceived risk, even before mines are confirmed, has already caused war risk insurance premiums to skyrocket.
How much are we talking?
Sources say some single voyage costs have already jumped by over 300%. That cost gets passed on, right? Leading to higher shipping fees, delivery delays for basically everything that moves by sea from that region. Now, if the strait were actually mined, marine insurers would almost certainly just suspend coverage.
Meaning no insurance, no sailing.
Exactly. No sane shipping company would risk transit without insurance, so commercial traffic would effectively grind to a halt. You'd have VLCCs, those very large crude carriers, and the LNG carriers just trapped inside the Persian Gulf. The supply crunch for oil and LNG would be like nothing we've seen. It wouldn't just be about price. It could lead to actual shortages, industrial shutdowns, energy crises in countries that rely heavily on those imports. And looking beyond the immediate crisis, if this instability persists, it would inevitably push longer-term changes. Buyers would be strongly incentivized to find oil and gas somewhere else, anywhere outside the Persian Gulf, even if it means longer, more costly shipping routes.
Diversification becomes urgent.
Absolutely. And you'd likely see lasting shifts in global supply chains, maybe more investment in ports on the Red Sea, a serious reevaluation, maybe even new construction of alternative pipelines, perhaps trying to go through Iraq or Syria to the Mediterranean, completely bypassing Hormuz. The whole energy map could start to redraw itself, trying to move away from relying so heavily on this one volatile choke point.
And in the immediate aftermath, of course, countries would turn to their strategic reserves, right? Their emergency stockpiles of oil.
They would, yes. Those strategic petroleum reserves, the SPRs, they offer a crucial buffer, a short-term cushion against the initial shock. But they are absolutely not a long-term fix.
Right, they run out.
Exactly. If the disruption lasts weeks or months, those reserves get depleted pretty fast. It just buys time. It doesn't solve the fundamental problem of the blocked supply.
Are there any real alternatives, pipelines that bypass the strait?
There are some, yes, but they're just not enough to compensate fully. Saudi Arabia has the East-West pipeline. The UAE has the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline. Iraq has the Kirkuk-Ceyhan line going to Turkey. But the key thing is, even if you add up the capacity of all those bypass pipelines, they do not collectively match the daily volume that flows through Hormuz.
Not even close.
Not even close. They could handle a fraction, maybe offset some of the loss, but they absolutely cannot replace the 21 million barrels a day plus the LNG. They're insufficient for a major prolonged closure. And critically, Qatar, which is so heavily reliant on its LNG exports, it has very, very few options for rerouting that gas. Its entire economic model basically flows through the Strait of Hormuz. They'd be exceptionally vulnerable.
It's such a complex situation, and one of the most fascinating parts, I think, is the legal dimension here, this kind of international tightrope walk over the status of the strait. How is navigation supposed to be governed there, according to international law? And why is there this fundamental disagreement?
Okay, so the main legal framework that's supposed to govern this is the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, usually called UNCLS. It's this huge, comprehensive treaty. And for straits used for international navigation, like Hormuz, UNLAOS establishes a regime called transit passage.
Transit passage, what does that mean exactly?
It basically means that all ships and aircraft have the right to unimpeded navigation and overflight through the strait, just continuous and expeditious transit. It's designed specifically to ensure freedom of movement through these critical maritime arteries. But, and this is the crucial point, the source of all the tension, Iran has signed UNCLOS, but it has never ratified it.
Okay, so they don't consider themselves legally bound by it in the same way.
Precisely. Instead, Iran argues that only the rules of innocent passage apply in its territorial waters within the strait. And under innocent passage rules, the coastal state Iran, in this case, has more authority, including the right to temporarily suspend passage if it deems it necessary for its security. So you have this fundamental clash. Unimpeded transit passage versus conditional innocent passage.
And where does the U.S. stand on this, given they also aren't a party to UNCLOS?
Right. The U.S. also hasn't ratified UNCLOS, but its position is that the transit passage provisions reflect customary international law.
Meaning they're binding on everyone anyway, treaty or not.
That's the U.S. view, yes. That these are established, universally accepted norms. And that's exactly why the U.S. Navy conducts what they call freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, through the strait. These aren't just symbolic patrols, they are deliberate actions designed to assert those navigational rights, to challenge what the U.S. sees as excessive maritime claims by Iran, or any other coastal state for that matter. It's about actively upholding that principle of free passage for everyone.
So if Iran did try to unilaterally block the strait, legally speaking, that would be a huge step. Our sources suggest it would almost certainly violate international law, specifically Article 44 of UNCLS, which forbids states bordering straits from impeding transit passage.
Right.
And it could potentially be seen as an illegal use of force under international law, which might even trigger the right of collective self-defense for the nations affected. It's not just an economic act. It's a direct challenge to the legal order.
Absolutely. And turning specifically to the mines, the legality there is also quite specific. Naval mines themselves aren't illegal weapons per se. They're regulated by international humanitarian law, like other weapons. However, international law clearly prohibits laying mines in international waters or international straits during peacetime.
Because of freedom of navigation.
Exactly. The Strait of Hormuz is undeniably an international strait. Now, even in an armed conflict, mines can only be used for specific lawful military purposes like defending your own coast or blockading an enemy port. They are explicitly forbidden if the sole purpose is just to intercept neutral commercial shipping, especially if they're laid indiscriminately without warning. So Iran potentially mining the strait, it's legally extremely precarious territory, which helps explain why the international reaction would likely be so strong, potentially including military intervention to clear them.
Which leads to deterrence. Because this is such a flashpoint, there are significant international efforts to deter Iran from taking that step.
Yes, very much so. You see it most obviously in the increased naval presence from the U.S. and its allies. Initiatives like Operation Sentinel or the European-led mission EMISO, European Maritime Awareness in the Strait of Hormuz. These are multinational efforts focused on providing maritime security, surveillance, ensuring safe passage.
Keeping eyes on this situation.
Right. And there was that very pointed example sources mention, the joint mine clearing exercise back in 2012. It took place off Bahrain, involved nearly 30 countries. That wasn't just routine training. It was a very clear, deliberate signal sent directly to Tehran.
Saying we can deal with this if we have to.
Precisely. A demonstration of collective capability and resolve to counter any attempt to mine the strait. But it's not all about military posture. There are constant diplomatic efforts happening too, often, behind the scenes, trying to de-escalate things. Exactly. Back-channel diplomacy, often facilitated by the EU, ongoing discussions at the UN Security Council. These are all aimed at finding diplomatic off-ramps, trying to prevent conflict. And a really interesting angle is the U.S. actively pushing China to use its influence with Iran.
Because China needs that oil too.
Immensely. China is hugely reliant on Gulf oil that comes through Hormuz. So the U.S. urges Beijing to basically tell Tehran, don't do this, it hurts us too. It just highlights this incredibly complex web of global interests, all trying in different ways to keep this fragile stability going in such a critical waterway.
So as we really dug into today, this enduring strategic fragility of the Strait of Hormuz, it's just undeniable, isn't it? It's this narrow passage, absolutely fundamental to global energy, global trade, and it's constantly caught in this push and pull between national sovereignty claims and international law, between using it as economic leverage and the very real risks of self-inflicted harm.
Absolutely. And look, while a full sustained closure remains, perhaps an extreme scenario because of those consequences for everyone, including Iran, this persistent crisis, this constant tension, it's already having effects. It might well accelerate shifts in trade routes we talked about, push more investment into alternative logistics, pipelines, and definitely speed up the diversification of energy supplies away from such a volatile single point. Even without a full closure ever happening, the ongoing instability has already fundamentally changed how global shipping perceives and manages risk. That's a lasting impact, regardless.
So here's something to think about. Considering that the Strait of Hormuz, despite everything, has never in its history been fully closed. What does that persistent underlying fragility really mean for the future? For global energy security, for the stability of the international order? How reliant are you really on these critical choke points? And what long-term changes might you start to see playing out in the global economy, maybe even in your own life, because of this constant tension simmering just beneath the surface?